The office holds the heat of the day long after the sun has given up on it. He sits with the desk lamp off, letting dusk come through the blinds in thin orange bars that lay across the floor like something spilled and forgotten. His cane rests against the wall within reach, the way it always does now, and his thumb moves over the corner of a cedar box the size of a Bible, back and forth, the wood gone smooth from 26 years of this same motion. "You want to know why I keep this," he says, not looking up. "Why an old man sits alone with a box he won't open in front of company." He says it to no one in the room. He says it to whoever is listening. Because tonight, finally, someone is. There's a gravel lot outside that door. You crossed it to get here. Maybe you noticed the way it slopes toward the road, how the dust rises even when there's no wind to speak of. Most people cross it without thinking. It's just gravel. It's just a lot in front of a clubhouse in a county nobody outside of it could find on a map. But I watched a woman run barefoot across that same stretch of ground once, in a wedding gown so white it looked like something that didn't belong to this world, mud already climbing the hem like it was trying to pull her back down into it. He lifts the box an inch off the desk, sets it down again, doesn't open it. Not yet. "That was a long time ago," he says. "Longer than you'd think, looking at me now, though I suppose you're looking at an old man, and everything before last Tuesday probably feels like a long time ago to you." Outside, the lot is empty except for 2 bikes leaned on their kickstands and the long blue shadow of the clubhouse reaching toward the road. Somewhere past the tree line, a dog barks twice and quits. The county has gone quiet the way it does at this hour, cicadas easing off, heat finally loosening its grip on the asphalt. "I'm going to tell you the whole thing," he says. "Not the version people tell each other over beers when they want to make us look better than we were. The real one. What she looked like coming up that drive. What her brother's notebook said. What her fiance chose when it came down to choosing." He finally looks toward the window, toward the lot, like he can still see her out there if he looks long enough. A shape in white, moving fast, mud already climbing. "There's a reason I've never told this one all the way through," he says. "But you asked, and your mother sent you here for a reason, and I figure you're old enough now to sit still for it. So sit. It's going to take the whole night. Might as well pour yourself something first." The truck had come up the county road just past 2 that afternoon, a gray 4-door with Ohio plates gone soft with dust, and it slowed the way vehicles slow when the driver isn't sure a place is really where he means to be. Gravel popped under the tires. The dog behind the tree line had barked then too, and quit then too, as though the county kept the same 2 notes in reserve for every stranger. He came up the walk narrow-shouldered and careful, the way boys raised by careful women tend to walk, and he knocked twice on a door that hadn't been locked in 11 years. The old man opened it, leaning on the cane, the way he opened every door now. Weight shifted onto the good hip before the bad one caught up, and for a moment he only looked, didn't speak. Just looked at the shape of the jaw, and the set of the mouth, and the particular way the young man's eyes moved, quick, assessing, already apologizing for the intrusion before any words came, and something in his chest turned over like a motor that hadn't been asked to run in years. "You've got her eyes," he said, before hello. Before anything. The young man blinked, caught off guard, and said his mother had sent him. Said it careful, like he'd rehearsed it in the car on the drive over, the kind of sentence a boy builds when he wants to get through a doorway without offending the person on the other side of it. Said there was a box. Said his mother didn't explain further than that, only that it was time, and that the man at this address would understand. The old man understood. He stepped back from the door and let the boy pass into the front room where the coffee had gone from steam to skin, and he did not go looking for the box just yet. He eased himself into the chair that had worn to the shape of his own spine, and set the cane against the table, with the particular care of a man who has learned what happens when a cane falls where he can't reach it. "Sit," he said. "Not an order, an offering. There's history in that box, and history doesn't come out right if you rush it." Outside the window, the gravel lot lay flat and pale under a sky gone white with morning heat, and it was that heat, that same relentless, shadeless, Sable County heat, that carried him backward the way a smell can carry a man backward, faster than memory usually allows. 26 years, he said. mostly to himself. 26 Julys since the corn stood shoulder high and dying of thirst, same as it always tried to that time of year, since the Vance land sat 2 mortgage payments behind and everybody in the county knew it, the way everybody in a small place knows the exact shape of a neighbor's trouble without ever being told outright. There'd been a farmhouse then, white paint gone gray, gutters hanging at the corners like a man's suspenders after a long shift. Both parents gone by then, the father first, heart, quick, no warning, the mother 2 winters later, slower, the kind of grief death nobody puts on a certificate but everyone recognizes. That left a young woman not yet 30 running the place alone, and running alongside her, always, a younger brother whose body had never quite agreed to do what his mind asked of it. She fed him, dressed him some mornings when his hands wouldn't cooperate, learned to read the little notebook he carried, before most people even knew to look at it. She did the books at night by the stove, because the bank called during the day. She did not complain, not where anyone could hear it, and the old man said that this, the not complaining, was the first thing folks in the county respected about her, and the thing that eventually put her in a wedding gown at all. She needed money the family didn't have, and 2 counties over, sitting on land and a construction business, and an old grudge about a farm that used to belong to somebody else's people, there was a family that had both the money and, as it turned out, a use for it. The old man set his coffee down without drinking from it, and the young man noticed he did that often, lifted the cup, held the heat against his palm, set it back down untouched, like the ritual mattered more than the drink. The son's family, he said, had been in Sable County longer than the county had a courthouse. Land first, then a sawmill, then trucks and concrete and a construction outfit that put up half the strip malls between here and the interstate. 3 generations of men who never had to ask twice for anything, and a 4th one coming up who'd been raised soft in the particular way that money makes a man soft. Not lazy, not cruel, just untested. He wasn't a bad one. That mattered later. He'd shake your hand and mean it. He drove a truck nicer than he needed, and felt a little sheepish about it, which the old man said was rarer in that family than people might think. His mother ran the business now that his father had passed, and she ran it the way some women run a household, quietly, from a chair, with a ledger nobody else was allowed to touch. His older brother handled the land deals, and it was the land that mattered here, though it took the old man a while to get to why. 2 families, he said, 2 pieces of dirt that used to be one, split by a property dispute 2 generations back that never fully settled, a line drawn wrong on a survey map in 1961, a lawsuit that dragged, a bitterness that outlived the men who started it. Half of what the Whitlocks farmed, technically, by the old plats, by the county's own tangled records, might have belonged to the Vance side all along. It had sat that way for decades, a splinter nobody pulled, because pulling it cost more than living with it. Then the girl's father died, and 2 winters later her mother and the family lawyer, the Whitlocks kept one on retainer the way other families kept a family doctor, noticed something. A marriage would settle it clean. No lawsuit, no judge, no county clerk digging through 1961 again. Just a wedding, a name changed, a deed quietly folded into one estate instead of 2 contested ones. The old man let that sit in the air a moment. Her mother told her it was love, he said. I believe some of it was. I believe the boy believed all of it. He looked toward the window, where the gravel lot still held the afternoon glare the same way it had that July, though nothing else about it, he said, was quite the same anymore. But love, he said, doesn't usually come with a lawyer already retained. He reached for his coffee again, and again did not drink it. The old man set the cup down without drinking from it, and for a while the only sound in the office was the clock above the filing cabinet, ticking through seconds that seemed to matter more than they should have. 2 days before, he said, she heard them talking. He said it plainly, the way he said most things, but he let it sit before he went on, as if the sentence needed room to breathe before it could carry the weight of what came next. The house had been full of caterers and rented chairs, he said, folding tables stacked against the porch rail, a florist's van parked crooked in the drive. She'd gone looking for a extension cord in the mudroom off the kitchen, because someone needed one for the lights strung along the tent poles, and the mother and the older brother were on the other side of the wall, in what had been her father's study before it became a room for storing things no one wanted to look at too closely. She wasn't listening. He was clear about that, like it mattered to him that she hadn't gone hunting for it. She was reaching for a cord on a hook, and the voices came through the wall, the way voices do in old houses, thin and unbothered, not expecting an audience. The brother's name, the older one, had said something about Fairhaven, said it the way a man says a word he's used before, comfortable in his mouth, said the paperwork was already signed, that the administrator there had assured them a placement could be arranged within the month, once things were settled. The mother had said something about it being for the best, that a household couldn't be expected to manage a grown man who needed the kind of care he needed, not with a new marriage starting, not with appearances to keep. The old man's jaw moved beneath his beard, some old muscle remembering something. She stood there with the cord in her hand, he said. Didn't move, didn't make a sound. He looked at the boy across from him. Your uncle kept a notebook, wrote things down when he couldn't say them out loud. She used to think it was just for him. Turned out it was for everybody, eventually. He didn't say what she felt standing in that mudroom, hearing her brother's whole future arranged like a delivery date. He didn't have to. The boy could see it in the way the old man's hand went still on the cane, in the long pause where his eyes fixed on nothing. She went back out and helped string the lights, he said finally, smiled at the florist, signed for a delivery. He shook his head slowly, more to himself than to the room. Something in a person can go quiet like that. Quiet isn't the same as calm. People confuse the two. He reached for the coffee a third time, and this time he drank it, though it had long since gone cold. The old man set the cup down and let the silence stretch, the way a man does when he's deciding how much of the morning to give away. Wedding day itself came in hot, he said. Middle of July, no wind to speak of, she told me later. The thermometer on the porch read 91 before 9 o'clock. He said it like the number mattered, like he'd carried it around for 26 years, because it was the kind of detail that proved the thing had really happened. She dressed in her father's old bedroom, the one that still smelled faintly of machine oil, no matter how many times it had been aired out. The dress hung on the closet door overnight, so the wrinkles would fall out of the skirt. Her hands weren't steady enough to manage the buttons at the back, so a cousin came in to do them, working up from the waist, humming something under her breath to fill the quiet. Her brother sat by the window in his chair, notebook open on the tray in front of him, pencil moving in short bursts and then stopping. He did that when a thought wouldn't settle into words easily. Write a little, look up, write again. She caught him at it twice and didn't ask what it was. That was the rule between them, unspoken but old. He showed her when he was ready, not before. The bouquet arrived wrapped in damp paper towel, white roses going a little soft at the edges from the heat already pressing against the walls. Someone opened a window, and the smell of cut grass came through, mowed early that morning for the reception, and under it something fainter, asphalt starting to soften on the county road out front. She remembers, she told him, sitting at the vanity while someone pinned her hair, watching her brother's hand in the mirror's reflection. He wrote for a long moment, longer than usual, then closed the notebook and set it on his lap like it had finished saying what it needed to say. He didn't hand it to her. He never did that unprompted. She thought, in the rush of pins and heat and the low hum of relatives moving through the house, that she would ask him about it later, after the ceremony, once there was time to sit with him, the way she always did in the evenings, coffee going cold between them, while he pointed at a word, and she read it back, to make sure she had it right. There would be time, she thought. There was always time with him. The old man looked down at his hands. She didn't read it that day, he said. Didn't read it for weeks, as it turned out. He didn't say more than that, not yet, letting the boy sit with the notebook the way she had, closed, waiting, full of something nobody else knew. Ray shifted his weight against the cane and let the silence stretch the way he let most silences stretch, as if hurrying through them cost something he wasn't willing to spend. Then he went on, and his voice dropped lower, the way it did when he was no longer performing the memory but living inside it again. She told him the church had smelled like lilies and candle wax, and underneath that, faintly, like the cedar pews someone had oiled the week before. Light came through the east windows in long gold bars that fell across the aisle runner, and dust moved through them slow as something underwater. Her brother sat in the front row on the bride's side, in the good blue shirt she'd ironed herself that morning, his wheelchair angled so he could see her without turning his neck too far, which cost him more than most people understood. She was 3 sentences into her vows when she saw it. Not a word. A look. Eleanor Whitlock, seated across the aisle in ivory silk, glanced at the brother, not unkindly, not cruelly, just briefly, the way a woman checks that a piece of furniture is still where she left it, and then looked away again, satisfied, already finished with him in her mind. It lasted less than 2 seconds. That's all it takes sometimes, Ray said. 2 seconds. A person's whole face tells you what's already been decided. Marisol had told him she didn't remember making the choice. She remembered only that her hands were still holding the vow card, that the pastor's voice had gone soft and expectant, waiting on her next line, that somewhere behind her someone shifted in a pew and the wood creaked. She remembered the weight of the dress pulling at her shoulders and her brother's hand resting flat and still on the arm of his chair, patient the way he was always patient, waiting for whatever came next because that was the only thing life had ever taught him to do. She set the card down on the altar rail. She didn't say anything to Colton. She didn't look at his mother again. She turned, gathered the skirts of the gown in both fists so she wouldn't trip on the hem, and walked back down the aisle the way she'd come up it minutes before, except now the church had gone utterly silent. No organ, no whispering, just the sound of her own steps, and the dress dragging faintly against the runner. Nobody stopped her. Ray said that was the part she came back to most, in later years, when she'd tell it herself over coffee. Not the leaving, but the fact that in a room full of people who loved her, or claimed to, not one of them moved. She didn't stop at the doors either. She kept walking, out into the noon heat, past the cars lined up along the gravel drive, toward the truck her brother had taught himself to work the pedals of years before, and didn't look back at the church once. Ray poured himself more coffee before he told this part, like he needed something to do with his hands. The old man across the table waited, watching steam curl up off the cup, watching him find the thread again. She didn't know where she was going. Not at first, he said. Just that she was going. The truck was older than she was practically, a faded blue thing with a bench seat and a shifter that stuck in second gear, and she drove it in that dress, with the skirts bunched up around the wheel, and her bare feet. She'd left the shoes somewhere, at the church or before it, nobody ever asked. Working the pedals her brother had taught himself to work years before, when the doctors said he never would. She drove with the windows down because the air conditioning had died sometime in the Clinton administration, and the heat came in off the blacktop in waves you could see. The kind of July heat that makes the horizon go soft and liquid, that makes a person's thinking go soft along with it. She didn't call anybody. She didn't have a plan the way plans are usually understood, a series of steps leading somewhere specific. What she had was a name, one her father used to say at the supper table when she was young enough to still be listening to supper table talk, back when the farm was still theirs outright, and trouble was a smaller animal than it later became. Iron Ridge, he'd said. Fixed my truck for nothing but a case of beer and wouldn't hear different. Good men out there, whatever people say about the Patches. She hadn't thought about that story in years. It came back to her on the county road like something surfacing out of dark water, whole and unbidden, and she followed it the only way she knew how. She remembered which direction her father used to drive when he went out that way, remembered the water tower and the burned-out feed store you passed before the turn, and she followed those markers instead of a map, because there was no map for what she was doing. The gravel lot came up on her sudden, the way places do when you're not sure you're looking for them until you are. Low building, corrugated roof, a line of motorcycles catching the sun like something laid out for inspection. She pulled in too fast, dust rising up around the truck in a pale cloud that hung there a long moment in the still air before it settled, and she sat with her hands on the wheel for a second before she cut the engine, looking at the building like it might tell her whether she'd made a mistake. She hadn't met a single man inside it. She didn't know a name to ask for. She just knew, somehow, that it was the place her father would have sent her. He was on the porch when the dust came up, though she wouldn't know that until later, wouldn't know he'd been sitting there since 6 that morning, with a cup of coffee gone cold beside him, and a bad knee stretched out in front of him like something he was still arguing with. He watched the truck come in too fast and thought, out of habit more than judgment, that whoever was driving it had never learned to read gravel, the way it shifts and grabs different from asphalt, the way it forgives less. Then the dust settled and he saw the dress. He did not move right away. Men who had ridden with him for 20 years would have told you that was the thing about him. He let a situation finish arriving before he stepped into it, the way you'd let a horse smell your hand before you closed it. He set the coffee down on the porch rail. He did not call out. He watched her sit there behind the wheel, with her hands still gripping it, watched the shape of her shoulders, the particular stillness of someone deciding whether to be brave, and something in his chest went quiet and old, and recognized it before his mind caught up to the recognition. She got out slow. The mud had dried dark and cracked along the hem of the dress, and beneath it her feet were bare and gray with road dust, one heel scraped raw where a shoe must have come off somewhere she hadn't bothered to stop for. Her hair had come half out of whatever it had been pinned into that morning, and there was a look on her face he had seen only twice before in his life. Once in a jungle 40 years behind him, once in his sister's kitchen, the week her husband's family sat her down at the table and told her how things were going to be. It was not fear exactly. Fear moves. This was the stillness that comes after fear has already done its worst, and left the person standing anyway, empty-handed, out of options, arrived. He came down the porch steps without hurrying, the cane he did not yet need waiting 20 years in his future, his boots finding the same gravel she'd nearly lost her footing on, and he stopped a respectful distance off, close enough to be heard, far enough not to crowd her. He did not ask her name. He did not ask what happened. He had learned, decades ago, that people carrying something that heavy needed to set it down at their own pace or not at all. He looked at the dress. He looked at her feet. He looked, last, at her eyes, and whatever he saw there made him say the only thing he could think to offer a stranger standing in his gravel lot in a wedding gown that had clearly seen a hard morning. You need to sit down before you say anything. She did not sit right away. She stood there a moment longer with her arms wrapped around herself like the dress was cold, though the morning was already thick with the kind of July heat that makes the air look bent. Then, something in her legs gave up arguing, and she lowered herself onto the bench, a young prospect dragged into the shade of the clubhouse overhang, the wood still damp from someone's hose down that morning. He brought her water in a jar because that was what was clean and close, and she held it without drinking it, turning it in her hands the way people do when they need something to do with their fingers. I wasn't supposed to hear it, she said finally. Not an apology. Just a fact she needed on the record. He said nothing. He'd learned that silence was a kind of hand held out. 2 days ago, through a door that wasn't shut all the way, she looked at the jar, not at him, his mother, his brother, talking about my brother like he was a line item. She stopped there for a long moment, long enough that a dog somewhere behind the clubhouse barked twice and went quiet. There's a place, she said, Fairhaven. They had papers already drawn up, signed, waiting on the marriage to go through first, something about the farm, about what's disputed until then. Her jaw worked. They were going to wait until I couldn't undo it. He kept his hands loose on his knees, the eagle on his forearm dulled by sun and years, and did not lean forward, did not press her for the parts she was clearly choosing not to hand over yet. How long she'd known, what she'd said to no one, whether the man she was supposed to marry knew any of it. He recognized the shape of a story being rationed out by someone who had learned, recently and hard, that giving too much at once could cost her everything. He's 19, she said, of the brother, unprompted, like his age was the only fact that mattered right then. He doesn't talk much when he's scared. He writes things down instead. She finally drank from the jar, a small sip, her hand not quite steady. I didn't think. I just got in the truck. Whose truck? He asked, the first question he allowed himself. His. My brother's. It was our father's before that. She looked up at him then, and there it was again. That stillness, older than her 26 years had any right to be. Your name was in one of his old books. From work he did on cars out here, a long time back. I didn't know where else the road went. He nodded slowly, filing that away with something that might have been the beginning of understanding, and looked past her toward the highway, where nothing was coming yet, though he already knew, the way a man knows weather, that something would be. He told her to wait where the light was, that someone would bring water and a clean towel for the hem of her dress, though both of them understood the dress was beyond towels now. Then he went inside, past the bar where two of his men were pretending not to have heard everything through the screen door, and into the small office at the back that had been his father's office once, before it was a clubhouse at all, before it was anything but a barn with good bones. He shut the door. He did not turn on the overhead light. There was a lamp on the desk that had worked for 30 years without complaint, and he used that instead, because the dimness suited what he was about to do, which was nothing anyone could see from the outside, just an old man, though he was not old yet then, only tired in the particular way of men who carry something they have never set down. The photograph was in the top drawer, beneath a stack of title transfers and a box of 38 rounds he no longer owned the gun for. He did not need to look for it. His hand went to the place the way a tongue goes to a broken tooth, out of habit worn smooth by repetition. His sister was 17 in the picture, squinting into a son that had been gone 40 years, wearing a dress their mother had made her for a dance he could no longer remember the name of. She had his father's jaw and their mother's eyes, and she was laughing at something outside the frame, something he had never asked her about because by the time he thought to ask, there was no asking her anything anymore. He had been in a jungle when the paperwork was signed. Some other country's reign, some other family's war. He had gotten the letter 9 weeks after the fact, damp through the envelope, his sister's handwriting smaller than usual, as if she were trying to take up less space on the page than she had in the argument. Her husband's people had wanted the boy raised a certain way, in a certain house, with a certain name on the school forms, and they had made it plain what leaving would cost her, and she had believed them, the way people believe men in good suits who speak slowly and never raise their voices. He had not been there to tell her not to believe them. He had not been there for any of it. Not the lawyer's visit, not the last night in that house, not the years after when she stopped answering the phone on the day the boy would have had a birthday. He set the photograph face up on the desk and did not touch it further. Outside, through the wall, he could hear the girl's voice, low, answering some question one of the younger men had asked her, and beneath it, fainter, the sound of a truck downshifting on the county road, still some distance off, still just a rumor of what it was carrying toward this gravel lot. The oldest man in the chapter, a patch holder who had ridden with him since before either of them carried gray in their beards, knocked once on the door frame and did not wait to be invited in. He had done this before, this quiet checking, in the years right after the sister's funeral, when the club president had gone 3 days without speaking more than what business required. He looked now at the photograph lying face up on the desk, at the woman's careful, shrinking handwriting, and he did not ask what it was. He had seen the letter before. He had simply never seen it looked at. He pulled the second chair around without asking and sat, the way old men sit when they intend to stay a while, and the club president found himself talking before he had decided to, the words coming out low and steady, none of the roughness he used for club matters. He said his sister had married into money, the way some people marry into weather, not understanding until they were inside it how much it would decide for them. He said her husband's family had never raised their voices, not once, and that this had frightened him more, hearing about it later, than if they had shouted. Men who threaten quietly, he said, mean it all the way through. He said he had been overseas when the lawyer came to her house, and overseas when she signed what she signed, and that by the time his enlistment ended and he came home to ask her why, she had already stopped being a person who answered that question. She had built a wall out of the shame of it, he said, brick by brick, and would not let him help her carry any of it down. He said the worst part was not the years of silence between them. The worst part was that when she finally called, 9 years before she died, it was to tell him she had made her peace with it, and he had believed her, because it was easier than not believing her. The old patch holder said nothing for a while. Then he said only that grief kept its own accounts, and that a man could not pay a debt to the dead, only to the living who reminded him of it. The club president did not answer that directly. He looked instead toward the wall, toward the sound still coming faint through it, the girl's voice, quieter now, and beneath it, the truck on the county road, no longer a rumor but a fact, its engine note settling into something the gravel lot would soon be able to name. He stood, slower than a man his age should have needed to, and reached for his jacket off the back of the chair, and said it was time he went out and stood where he should have stood the first time. He crossed the main room without hurry, the cane not yet a fixture in his hand back then, just a body that still answered when asked to move fast. A prospect stood by the payphone bolted to the wall near the kitchen, receiver pressed so hard to his ear it had gone white at the knuckle, and he was saying yes, and he was saying I understand, and when he hung up, he did not have to explain what he had heard, because his face had already said it. They were coming. The mother first, then the older son, then a man in a gray suit who had driven up from the county seat with papers in a leather case, and behind them, trailing at a distance the way people trail behind something they are ashamed to be seen agreeing with, the groom. The club president asked how long. The prospect said maybe 2 hours, judging by the call, maybe less. He asked who else knew. The prospect said nobody yet. The club president told him to go get the address book, the real one, the one kept in a drawer under the register, thick with names in different hands going back 15 years, and to start at the top. It did not take much. It never did, with men who had spent decades building a language out of exactly this kind of silence. A call that said only where and when, no explanation needed, because the explanation had already been lived once by nearly every man on that list in some other form, some other woman, some other gravel lot. Word went out the way water finds the low ground without deciding to. The first bike came in under 20 minutes. A big man on a machine, older than some of the girl's own years, riding in off Route 9, with dust still rising behind him in the heat, like something following him home. Then 2 more, then 4, the sound arriving before the shape of them did, a low building hum that the county had learned to recognize the way it recognized thunder before rain, something felt in the chest before it was heard in the ear. By the time the sun had moved another hand's width across the white sky, the lot had begun to fill, men easing off engines that ticked as they cooled, removing helmets, saying little, looking first at the clubhouse door and then at the same road the trucks would eventually come down, as if measuring the distance in advance. The club president stood near the porch steps and counted without meaning to, the way a man counts pallbearers, and did not stop counting until the number in his head matched something closer to certainty than hope, 35 when it was done. 35 men who had dropped whatever the afternoon had been holding for them and come instead to stand in a gravel lot in July heat for a woman none of had ever met, because the man standing on the porch steps had asked, and because the asking had come rare enough in 20 years that it carried its own kind of weight. They did not organize themselves. That was the thing the old man wanted the boy to understand, all these years later, sitting across from him with the coffee gone cold between them. Nobody gave an order. Nobody drew a line in the gravel with a boot heel and said, "Stand here." They simply arranged themselves the way water finds a level, first in 2s and 3s near the fence line, then filling in toward the center until the space between the clubhouse and the road had become something with a shape to it, something that had not existed an hour before and now could not be unmade. Boots first. That was what he remembered. The boots, more than the faces, more than the leather. Steel-toed and cracked at the seams, some resoled twice, standing planted in a line, as if they had grown up out of that gravel the way the fence posts had. Above them, patches faded by 20 summers of the same white sun, thread gone thin and pale, where a man's shoulder had rubbed against 1,000 miles of wind. A few of the older members still wore black from funerals 2 decades cold, the dye never quite restored, and nobody had ever told them to buy new. The engines ticked as they cooled, one after another, a soft percussion under the heat, the only sound for a while, besides the wind moving through the tall grass at the property's edge. No one spoke much. A man passed a canteen down the line without being asked. Another rolled his shoulders once, twice, the way a man does before a shift he has worked too many times to fear anymore. Somewhere near the middle, an old veteran with a government-issue tattoo, faded blue-green on his forearm, stood with his arms crossed and his eyes fixed on the road, patient in the particular way of men who have waited for worse things than a truck full of lawyers. The girl watched them from the porch window, her brother's hand tight around two of her fingers, and the old man remembered that, watching more than he remembered his own thinking in that hour, the way her face had changed, not with relief exactly, something quieter than relief, something closer to disbelief that a debt so old could still be paid to a stranger. He told the boy that 35 was not a large number, not compared to armies, not compared to floods or fires, or the ordinary catastrophes a county absorbed and forgot. But standing in that lot, watching the road for the dust that would eventually rise from it, it had felt, for the first time in his life, like enough. The dust came at 2:40, the old man said. He remembered the time because he had looked at his watch out of habit, the way a man checks his pulse without meaning to, and the number had stayed with him for 26 years, the way small useless facts do when they are attached to something large. 3 vehicles, a black sedan too clean for the road it was on, a pickup with a company logo on the door, and behind them a sensible gray car that could only have belonged to a lawyer, the kind of car built to look like it was not judging anyone while judging everyone. They stopped at the gravel line because they had no choice. 35 men do not move for horns. The woman who got out of the sedan first wore a suit the color of a storm that had not yet decided to be a storm, and she looked at the line of riders the way a person looks at a fence they expect to be decorative. Her son, the older one, not the groom, came around from the driver's side already talking, already reaching for the authority of words like trespassing and private property, and my attorney will, and the lawyer trailed a half step behind him carrying a folder that seemed, in that dust and heat, almost apologetic for existing. Nobody answered him. That was the whole of it. 35 men looked at him the way men look at weather, and said nothing, and the nothing did more work than any threat could have. He tried again. Louder this time, a hand gesturing at the clubhouse, at the gravel, at the girl's truck parked crooked by the porch like evidence of something. He used the word charges twice. The old man remembered that the woman, the mother, did not speak at first. She stood a little apart from her son, her hands folded in front of her, the way women of a certain upbringing are taught to fold them, and for one moment, brief enough that a careless man might have missed it, something moved through her face that was not entitlement and was not anger. It looked, he said, like fear. Not fear of the men. She was too practiced for that, too armored in the certainty of lawyers and land deeds. It was smaller than that. It looked like a woman realizing, for one unguarded second, that the outcome she had already written in her mind might not be the outcome the world had planned. It passed quickly. She smoothed it the way she probably smoothed every inconvenient thing in her life, and when she spoke it was to the lawyer, not the men, a low instruction about documentation, about calling the sheriff if necessary, her voice pitched for an audience that was not there. The line did not move. Somewhere behind the porch window, the old man said, the girl had gone very still, and her brother's hand had tightened again around her fingers, and it was in that stillness, more than in anything the lawyer said, that he understood the afternoon had only just begun to ask what it would cost. Ray set his coffee down without drinking it, and the sound of the mug meeting the table seemed, in the quiet clubhouse, louder than it should have been. That was when the boy came forward, he said. Not the mother, not the brother with his phone still raised. The groom. He said it took Colton 3 tries to get his legs moving, like the gravel itself was arguing against him, and when he finally broke from beside his mother's car, Eleanor's hand shot out and missed his sleeve by an inch. Nobody stopped him. 35 men who would not let a lawyer cross that line stepped back half a foot each, wordless, and let the boy through, because some things a line is not built to block. He stopped 6 feet from her. Ray remembered the space exactly. 6 feet, no more, because it was the distance of a man who wanted to close it and did not trust himself to. His face had gone the color of old paper. Marisol. His voice cracked on the second syllable, and he said her name like it was the only word he'd practiced, and none of the others had come with it. Please. Can we just talk? Not here. Not like this." She did not answer right away. Ray said the not answering was its own kind of answer, the kind that takes a woman years to learn how to give. Behind them, no engine turned over. 35 bikes sat dead silent in the heat, and the silence had a texture to it, he said, thick as the July air pressing down on the tin roof of the clubhouse, pressing on every shoulder in that lot like a hand held flat against the chest. The brothers' fingers, still wrapped around hers, did not loosen. "They already signed it," she said finally. Not loud. She wasn't performing for the porch or the lawyer or the men in leather. She was talking to the boy in the good suit, like there was no one else standing in Sable County that afternoon. "Before you asked me, before any of this, you knew, didn't you? Or you let yourself not know." Colton's mouth opened, closed. Ray said that was the part that stayed with him longest. Not what the boy said, but what he couldn't. A man reaching for a denial and finding his hands empty. "It's not that simple," he managed. "It's my mother's. The farm, the trust. It's not just me. There's—" "Say his name," Marisol said, and nodded once toward her brother, without looking away from Colton's face. "You've known him 4 years. Say his name and tell him what you signed." The heat did not move. The crowd did not move. Somewhere past the tree line, a single cicada started and stopped, as if even it had thought better of interrupting. Ray said he had seen men choose wrong before, plenty of times, in plenty of ugly rooms, but he had never watched it happen this slow, this visible, a man's whole future rearranging itself behind his eyes, while 35 strangers stood close enough to hear him breathe. Ray said, the old man telling it now, still remembered the exact way the boy's hands moved, because hands, he'd learned over 70 years, told the truth a mouth would spend its whole life lying about. Colton's hands went to his belt, then to nothing, then folded in front of him, the way a man folds his hands at a funeral when he doesn't trust them to do anything else. He looked at his mother first. That was the tell. Not at the woman standing in a ruined dress in a gravel lot, who had loved him enough to run to him even after she'd run from him, but at the small, sharp-shouldered woman by the black sedan, whose face had not moved once since she arrived. "Colton," she said. Just his name. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. He looked down at his brother-in-law's wheelchair, at the boy in the notebook's silence, and something in his jaw worked like he was chewing on a word too large to swallow. Nobody spoke. Ray said that was the strangest part of the whole afternoon. 35 grown men who'd stood in worse rooms than this, who'd buried brothers and done things they didn't confess even to each other, and every one of them stood still as fence posts because a kid in a rented suit couldn't get a sentence out. "I can't undo the trust," Colton finally said, and his voice came out smaller than his size. My father set it up before he died. Garrett's the executor. If I fight it, I lose the farm too. Not just—" He stopped, looked at Marisol like he was hoping she'd finish the sentence in some kinder shape than he could manage. She didn't. "Say his name," she said again, quieter this time, which somehow carried further than the first time. Colton looked at the boy in the chair. The boy looked back at him, with the flat, unblinking patience Ray said he'd never forget, a patience that had nothing pleading in it, nothing that needed to be pleaded with. Colton's mouth opened around the name, and Ray watched it die there, watched the boy choose, in real time, in front of 35 strangers, and his own mother, and the woman who had run through wet grass in a wedding gown, to save someone he could not bring himself to protect. "I can't lose everything for this," he said finally. Not the boy's name. Not even close to it. Marisol did not cry, did not raise her voice, did not do any of the things Ray had braced himself to comfort. She simply reached up, unpinned something small from her collar, and set it without ceremony on the hood of the nearest truck, the way a person sets down something they no longer wish to carry through a door. The ring came off easier than anyone expected, no hesitation, no last look at it glinting in July light before it left her hand. She simply worked it over the knuckle, the way a person removes a splinter, wanting it gone more than she wanted to be careful about it. She held it out to him on an open palm the way you'd return something borrowed too long. He took it. That was the part the old man dwelled on longest. Decades later, cane hooked over the arm of his chair, coffee gone cold in front of him, while the young man across the table sat very still and did not touch his own cup. He took it, the old man said again, like the detail deserved a second pass. Didn't drop it, didn't throw it, put it right in his coat pocket, careful, like it still meant something to somebody. He looked toward the window, toward the gravel lot outside, where 35 men had once stood shoulder to shoulder, and where now there was only a dented pickup and a stray dog nosing the fence line. That's what money does to you when you've had it your whole life. Makes leaving quiet. No slamming doors. No shouting. Just paperwork nobody signs, and a ring going back in a pocket, and everybody pretending it's decent because nobody raised their voice. In the memory, the mother did not gloat. That was the detail that unsettled him most at the time. Watching her face for triumph, and finding instead something closer to relief. The particular relief of a woman who has gotten exactly what she wanted and is smart enough not to celebrate it in front of witnesses. The lawyer folded the unsigned papers back into his briefcase without a word, the way a man packs up a fishing rod after the fish has already swum off. No use pretending there's still a job to do. The brother, the older one, put a hand on the groom's shoulder, and Ray remembered thinking it looked less like comfort than like a leash being taken up again, gently, the way you'd lead a horse back to a stable it had almost bolted from. They left without another word to her. 3 vehicles pulling out through the gap where the men had stood, gravel popping under the tires, dust hanging in the heat long after the taillights turned onto the county road and were gone. Nobody in the lot moved for a long moment after that, as if the men themselves needed to be told the danger had passed, the way animals do, reading it off each other's shoulders before trusting it with their own bodies. She stood there in her ruined dress with her hand still open, empty now, and Ray remembered thinking she looked less like someone who had lost something than someone who had just set something down after carrying it a very long way. The wheelchair's small motor whirred once beside her, the boy angling himself closer, and she reached down without looking and rested her palm flat against his shoulder, the way you'd steady yourself against a fence post, not the other way around. That evening, after the lot had emptied and the light had gone the color of weak tea through the clubhouse windows, she sat with her brother at the long table where the club took its meals, and he would not eat. He kept looking at the bag strapped beneath his chair, the canvas one that never left him, and Ray watched from across the room, pretending to clean a carburetor that was already clean, because he had learned long ago that some things had to be allowed to happen in their own time, or not at all. The boy unzipped the bag himself. His hands did not move quickly. They never did. But they moved with a determination that made everyone in the room go quiet without being asked to. He drew out the notebook, the one with the water-stained cover and the rubber band gone soft with age, and he opened it, not to a random page, but to one he had folded down at the corner weeks before, deliberately, the way a man marks a page in a will. He turned it toward his sister and set his finger beneath the first line. She read it standing up, then sat down slowly, as if her legs had been informed of something her mind was still catching up to. The handwriting was careful in the way his handwriting was always careful, each letter built rather than written, the effort of it visible in the unevenness of the ink, and it recorded, in dates, a conversation he had overheard from his room 3 weeks before the wedding. The names were correct. The word institution was there, spelled out fully, not abbreviated, because he did not trust himself with shortcuts. Beneath it, in smaller letters, he had written what the inheritance was, and what date it was tied to, and who had said the word once the money cleared. Nobody at the table said anything for a while. Ray set the carburetor down. He had known, Ray understood then, not suspected, known, and written it down the careful way a man documents a thing he expects someone, someday, will need to see. He had been carrying it in that bag for weeks, through the fitting for the dress, through the rehearsal dinner, through the morning of the wedding itself, waiting for the moment his sister would be ready to receive it, or the moment the world would force her to be. She held the notebook against her chest with both arms the way she might have held him as a child, and she did not cry, which surprised Ray more than if she had. She only nodded, once, at her brother, and he nodded back, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with speech. Ray drove into town the following morning to ask an old friend from his war years, a man now practicing family law out of a converted feed store, whether a document like that, handwritten, dated, kept in a disabled man's own careful script, could hold up as evidence of anything at all. The lawyer's name was Duval, and Ray remembered him mostly for the way he used to check his boots for scorpions before putting them on, a habit from a desert neither of them talked about much anymore. He read the notebook at his desk without looking up for 11 minutes. Ray counted them, the way he counted most things that mattered: heartbeats, miles, minutes a man stayed quiet before he told you something true. "This isn't hearsay," Duval said finally. "This is a contemporaneous record, dated, specific. A judge doesn't get to wave that away because the hand that wrote it shakes." He asked to keep it overnight, made a copy at the courthouse annex the next morning, handed the original back, sealed in a plastic sleeve, like something that had earned the right to be protected. He filed the motion inside a week, a challenge to the guardianship agreement on grounds of coercion and lack of informed consent. The notebook entered as Exhibit A, page after page in that careful, patient handwriting, describing dates and rooms, and the exact words a mother-in-law-to-be had used about a place called Fairhaven. There was a hearing. Ray did not go. That part belonged to her, and he understood by then the difference between standing beside someone and standing in front of them. He heard about it after, second-hand, the way he heard most things that mattered. The Whitlock family's own lawyer, faced with a document that could not be argued into fiction, advising a quiet settlement rather than a public one. No trial, no testimony read aloud in a courtroom with strangers in the gallery, just a judge's signature, and then another, and the agreement that had been drawn up to secure a farm and empty a young man's life into an institution ceased, on paper, to exist. She called the clubhouse the afternoon it was final. Ray took the phone in his office, the same room the notebook itself would occupy for the 14 years remaining, and she said only, "It's done," in a voice that did not shake at all, and he found that harder to hear than if it had. Her brother did not go to Fairhaven. He never would. He stayed in the house on the county road with his sister, and later, when she married again, in the house she shared with a mechanic from the next county over, a man who never once made him feel like an arrangement, rather than a brother-in-law. He kept the notebook himself for years afterward, added to it sometimes, small, ordinary things, weather, meals, the names of dogs, as if the habit of writing down what happened around him had become simply how he lived in the world now, rather than a thing he'd been forced into by necessity. Ray set his coffee down. The cane leaned where he'd left it, against the table's edge, patient as a dog waiting to be walked. "That should have been the end of it," he said, "the part where I tell you it was over." He looked toward the window, toward the gravel lot gone gold in the late light. It wasn't, though, not for the club, not yet. The sun shifted in his chair, the leather creaking under him the way it must have creaked under 35 other men, over 35 other years. He did not ask what came next. He had learned by now that the old man would arrive at it in his own time, the way weather arrives, unhurried by anyone's waiting. 2 months, Ray said. That's how long it took the lawyer to unwind what her fiance's mother had built. Judges are slow, paper is slower. He turned his cup a quarter turn on the table, an old habit, as if aligning it to some compass point only he could see. But it came apart. The notebook did most of the work. 19 years old, and he'd written down every ugly thing they said in that kitchen, dates and all. Turns out being underestimated is its own kind of armor. He said the club held something in the lot that August, once the papers were signed, and the thing was truly finished, not a party. He was careful about that word. A gathering, low and quiet, the way men gather who don't know the shape of a ceremony, but understand the need for one anyway. Someone had ordered a patch made special, small enough to pin to a wheelchair's canvas back, the thread still stiff with newness. Little brother, it read, nothing more. No wings, no eagle, none of the iconography the older members wore into the ground. Just those 2 words, sewn straight. He wouldn't let anyone else pin it on him, Ray said. Did it himself. Took him near 10 minutes, fingers not always going where he sent them, and every man in that lot stood there and let him take his 10 minutes. Nobody reached in to help. That was its own kind of respect, not helping. His eyes stayed on the window a moment. He wore it every day after that. I heard it was still pinned there when he passed. The son said nothing. He had done the arithmetic already, sitting in a kitchen years before, when his mother mentioned once, briefly, an age and a year, and he had not pressed her for more. She came by that same afternoon, Ray went on. Gravel lot, evening light, same as this. Had a little wooden box with her, cedar. Hinges she'd oiled so they wouldn't creak. I noticed that. Small thing to notice, but I noticed it. Handed it to me like she was passing off something breakable. Said it wasn't a gift so much as it was something she couldn't carry into the next part of her life. Didn't want it in a closet somewhere reminding her. He paused. Didn't say goodbye like people usually do. Just got in that truck, brother in the seat beside her, patch pinned to his shirt that day instead of the chair, and drove out past the gate. He set his cup down and did not reach for it again. I put the box in my desk, he said. Didn't open it for a week. When I did, he stopped there. The way a man stops at the edge of water he isn't sure is shallow enough to walk into yet. When he did, he found the veil folded the way a woman folds something she has practiced folding 100 times without ever wearing it again, corners squared, tissue paper gone soft at the creases. He closed the lid and did not open it a second time for a long while. 5 years passed the way years do out here, in dry seasons and wet ones, in engine work and funerals for men who had ridden longer than they should have. Word came through the kind of channels that carry news in small counties. A cousin of a cousin, a man who fixed transmissions 2 towns over. She had married a mechanic. Steady man, quiet, good with his hands and better with patience, which was the only quality Ray had ever thought worth vetting a man for. A year after that, a son. Ray heard the boy's name once and forgot it on purpose, not from indifference, but because some things belonged to her now, and not to the gravel lot. Her brother kept the patch pinned through all of it. Pinned to church clothes, pinned to the flannel he wore working in the yard, pinned crooked more often than straight because he did it himself and refused help doing it. He came by the clubhouse twice a year, Christmas and the 4th, rolled in by whoever was driving, and the men treated it as unremarkable, which was its own kind of tribute. He wrote things in a new notebook by then, different from the old one, softer subjects, weather, meals, which writers had put on weight. Small human ledger of a life being lived rather than survived. 14 years after the wedding that didn't happen, he died in his sleep. Natural causes, the kind that come for a body regardless of what county it was born in or what family failed it. 33 years old. Ray was 71 that spring and rode to the funeral anyway, cane-strapped where a saddlebag used to go, because some obligations outlast the joints that used to carry them easily. He stood at the back of a small church that smelled of cut flowers and floor wax, and when the casket passed, he saw the patch had been pinned to the lapel of the suit they buried him in. Someone, her, surely, only her, having thought to ask the funeral home to leave it be. Ray did not cry at the service. He cried after, alone in the truck, both hands on the wheel and the engine off, for reasons that had less to do with the boy in the casket than with a woman on a base overseas. 30 years before that, he had failed to call when it might have mattered. He never told anyone that part. He was telling it now, to the one person who had a right to hear it, in the same gravel lot, the light going the same amber it always went at this hour, as if the county itself hadn't learned anything new in 26 years. The old man was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that the young man began to think the story had simply run out, the way a creek runs thin and disappears into gravel before it reaches the river it was headed for. But Ray was only gathering something. His hand, when he finally moved it, went to the cane leaning against the picnic table, not to stand, but to steady himself for what came next, the way a man braces before lifting something heavier than its size would suggest. He reached instead beneath the table, to a shelf bolted there years ago for exactly this purpose, and brought up the cedar box. It was smaller than the young man had imagined it all his life, hearing his mother mention it only twice, both times in a voice that closed the subject as soon as she opened it. The wood had gone the color of strong tea, the brass hinges dulled but not rusted, someone having oiled them on some anniversary of a day nobody but Ray still marked on a calendar. He set it on the table between them and did not open it. "She'll know what's inside before you get it out of the truck," he said. "Don't need to show her, just needs to arrive." The young man put his hand flat on the lid, not lifting it, only feeling the grain of it, warm from the shelf, warmer than the evening air now settling gray-blue over the gravel lot. Somewhere behind them a screen door closed, soft, and did not open again. The bikes along the fence line had gone from silver to shadow shapes, and the flag on its pole had stopped moving as the wind let go of the day the way it always did at this hour, all at once and without ceremony. He kept the patch on his chair, Ray said, every day, until the day they buried him with it instead. "She'll want to know that part especially. Say it plain. Don't dress it up for her." The young man nodded, and found he did not trust his voice yet to answer, so he didn't try. They sat that way a while, the cedar box between them like a third presence at the table, and neither man moved to fill the silence, because both of them understood, without needing to say so, that some silences were not empty, but simply full of things too large to hand across in words. The gravel lot held the last of the light along its western edge, the same lot, the same amber slant, though the men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder across it had mostly gone the way men go, into the ground or into memory, leaving Ray as the last one who remembered exactly where each of them had stood. Somewhere past the fence, a dog barked twice and quit. The porch light came on by itself, the way it did every evening at the same hour, and neither of them reached to acknowledge it, both content, for now, to let the dark finish arriving on its own. The young man rose when the last of the light gave out, and he carried the cedar box to the truck the way he imagined his mother had once carried other things, careful, both hands, not trusting the weight to one arm alone. The old man did not walk him to the gate. He stood on the porch instead, one hand on the rail, and watched the taillights find the highway and shrink until the dark took them the way the dark takes everything eventually, without hurry, without apology. The drive home took the better part of 2 hours, and for most of it the box sat on the passenger seatbelt drawn across it like a passenger of its own, and he did not open it again. He had seen enough. He understood that some things were meant to be handed over whole, not picked apart on a dark road at 70 miles an hour, and so he let it ride beside him in silence, the way his mother had once ridden beside a brother who could not speak, but who had written down, in his own careful hand, the truth that saved them both. Back at the clubhouse, in the weeks that followed, a member with steady hands and a woodworking habit built a shadow box out of pine, deep enough to hold a folded veil and a small round patch stitched with 2 words, and they hung it beneath the old wooden sign that had watched over that gravel lot longer than most of the men who rode past it now had been alive. "What we protect, we keep." The letters had faded to the color of driftwood, but no one had ever thought to repaint them, because a thing that true did not need to shout. Ray watched them hang it from his chair by the window, and he did not offer instruction, because there was none to give. When it was done, the room emptied, the way rooms do after work is finished, men drifting off toward coffee and small talk, and he was left alone with it, the way he had been alone with the box for 26 years, except now the weight had passed to a wall instead of a shelf, which felt, to him, like the right kind of ending, the kind that did not require him to carry it by himself anymore. He thought, as he often did at that hour, of a July afternoon and 35 men standing in gravel who did not know yet what they were proving, only that they would not move. He thought of a sister he had failed and a bride he had not, and how the space between those 2 facts had taken him the better part of a lifetime to make peace with. Promises, he had come to understand, were cheap in the saying. They were only ever proven on the one day someone was asked to step aside, and didn't. Outside, the light was going gold again, same as it always did, indifferent to the years it had watched pass through that lot. He sat with it a while longer, the way old men do, and then he reached for his cane, and he did not look back at the wall, because he no longer needed to. He knew exactly what it said,